Por dentro está herida por una noche en su lecho. Soy capaz de dar la vida.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Demystifying Critical Race Theory. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Okay. Welcome.
And something without one love bears heavy on my mind. Then I look at you, and the world's all right with me. Just one look at you, and I know it's gonna be a lovely day. When the day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face, when someone else instead of me always seems to know the way, then I look at you, and the world's all right with me. Just one look at you, and I know it's gonna be a lovely day. When the day that lies ahead of me seems impossible to face, and when someone else instead of me always seems to know the way, then I look at you, and the world's all right with me. I just one look at you, and I know it's gonna be a lovely day.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Liberated Ethnic Studies, Demystifying Critical Race Theory. This week in Yorba Linda, we saw a interesting conversation among board members who were about ready to pass a resolution against critical race theory. And while this isn't new, we know that 23 states, including one who outlawed it in higher education, basically banned critical race theory from teaching. We also know that in many cases, those who argue against it do not even know what it is. And this was a case in Yorba Linda this week when board members basically tabled the resolution because not a single board member could come up with the definition which they could agree upon. And so they couldn't ban something they didn't know. So today, this morning, Liberated Ethnic Studies Monocurriculum Coalition, we bring you a session about critical race theory, and more importantly, about how it is and isn't applied in our classrooms in California. So welcome to our session.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you, Teresa. Just a couple of announcements before we begin. We'd like to, again, welcome you and thank you so much for being here today. We also appreciate those of you who were able to make a donation. If you would still like to do that, you can go to our homepage and make a donation to support our work. Also, a reminder that we are recording. We are live streaming on YouTube so that you know that's happening. Next announcement is that after 30 minutes, we will lock the meeting. So if you leave and you want to come back after 30 minutes, you won't be able to. So please keep the Zoom going if you want to come back, if you have to step away. And then finally, if you have any questions, you'll notice that you can chat with Lupe. So go ahead and send those questions to Lupe, and then we can bring those back during our Q&A towards the end of the program. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll pass it back to Teresa.
Next slide, please. So these are our LESMC staff who have put together a fabulous session for you. So Art Nelson, Brian, Allison, Mary, Tanya, Lupe, Jeffrey, and Trisha, take it away.
Are you with me?
Yes, we are, Mary.
Okay, awesome. So this morning, Lamata Lauva, good morning. As we come together today, we are going to acknowledge that we are on and we are guests on the traditional homelands of California's First People. Let us acknowledge their past, their present, their future contributions to our California's culture, as well as their struggles to be resilient and passing on their words, their songs, their traditions, and caring for the lands of all that we live on. And let us also recognize that we are not just visitors to people, but also the lives of our animals and our plants. And we need to be ambassadors and be very careful caretakers to our lands. I this morning would like to acknowledge the people, the first people of Las Vegas, who are the Southern Paiutes of our lands here. So I'm a guest on their lands. So I don't know if you want to have people acknowledge in the chat, but if you could acknowledge in the chat where you are a guest upon which traditional lands. Okay, I'm going to go on, and also along with this, I'd like to also continue with our ancestor acknowledgement. And I'm so excited to present to you and bring into the space Catherine Sobel. Catherine Sobel is a phenomenal woman when throughout her life she's been was a traditional mountain Kauai. She was an author. She was a She was an author. She was a tribal chairwoman. She was the founder of the Moki Museum on the Morongo Reservation. She was also instrumental in bringing people together and making sure that she co-authored information and history and the stories of the Kuya people with Lowell Bean. She is an anthropologist. She was one of the first women who sat on the governor's Native American Heritage Commission. So I'd like to bring her into our space and acknowledge her presence. Along with that, she was my husband's aunt. So knowing her for all these years was very special. Thank you.
So welcome everybody. I'm Lupe Carrasco Cardona. I'm one of the co-founders of the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, and I'm going to lead you today on a little cultural energizer. So as you know, many of us are probably on our fall break, and there's a day of thanks that's coming sometime next week that, you know, we remember in many ways, not for the positive elements, but also for the thanks that we give to one another. And so what I'd like y'all to do is to take out your cell phone, and I want you to craft a message to someone who you are thankful for that you don't often say thank you to. And let's craft that message and let's send that out to them. Let's give somebody a nice surprise of thanks right now. And so I'm actually gonna do this exercise with you, this cultural energizer. I'm gonna thank my mom. My mom is a wonderful human being who always kind of was the person who she didn't care if she was kind of the bad one, you know, that she was the strict one. She was the one that you know, did the unpopular decisions in the family. And we always, as you know, my siblings and I, we always gave a lot of credit to my father. We always, you know, kind of uplift him, and he's been passed away. He's an ancestor as well for the last 15 years. So it's real easy to always talk about my tata, and forget about my mom. So today I'm gonna send her a text of gratitude and thanks. And so I'd like to invite you all to do the same. So let's go ahead and take about maybe like a minute to do that, and I'll play a little bit of music while we do that. Thank you all for participating in that. Is there anyone who would like to share their text of gratitude that they just sent to someone who should often hear how grateful that we are, but often don't. I sent my mom her. I'm sure she's going to be kind of shocked because I thank her in context, but not random things. Would anyone like to share a text of gratitude that was sent?
I can. So I just thank you. So I'm grateful for this exercise and this practice. First of all, and then I texted my parents, both my mom and my dad, in Viet. Cảm ơn ba má cho ban tình thương cho các con, and I felt really liberating and healing and joyful.
Yay, thank you. You gave me chills. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you all, and keep us posted in the chat. Like if you get, a really positive response from your family member. Hi. Yeah, let us know. We want to hear about that and get more goosebumps with you all. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Trish.
Thank you. My sister sent back a heart to me for the text. And then, of course, she said, what brought that on? So it was definitely a surprise. So thank you for that. All right. So if we'll move into the agenda and just give you a brief overview, we are going to start with a panel, which I'll be moderating next. And then we're going to do a little bit of background information on what CRT is and what it isn't. Then you're going to get to see 3 sample shortened but sample lessons of how CRT is implemented in the classroom. And then we'll move into some resources and Q&A for everyone. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and move into our panel. And the key questions that we're looking at are, which are, many of you might be here because of these questions, but, why is it that we are experiencing pushback, and what can be done? We are in a time of intense reaction, and we have some experts here that can talk with us and sort of unpack what's happening. So that first question of why are we experiencing pushback? Why are there so many attacks on CRT in the news and on social media and on ethnic studies? Why are we here today? What is happening historically, et cetera? So I'm going to ask that our panelists, Tanya, Art, and Allison, go ahead and start taking up that particular question. How did we get here?
I can start. Good morning, everyone. I think of this as an educator, and I even think about our curriculum and our first unit on self and this whole notion of identity, right? And it makes me think about how folks identify. And I think we have individuals, right, who their identity is related to and connected with our American institutions, right? And as we, through critical race theory and our practices, and we're looking, we want to make our nation accountable and the best that it can be, right? To live up to the ideals and the promises of our nation. And so we are taking this critical lens, right, at what that actually looks like and where we're falling short and where we consistently fall short within our institutions, right? And others, because that's their identity, right, they're unable to separate their own identity from the institutions themselves. And then it becomes perceived as a personal attack, right, which is just not true. I think we also have to look at that these are systems, right, that we are critiquing and that we are analyzing. And so with that, the system is set up to defend itself, right? It's set up to protect itself and to keep its structures. So right now we have states, right? This isn't just individuals going back and forth at a school board meeting, right? These aren't just different groups of people within a community. We actually have 8 states and counting that have passed anti-CRT legislation, right? And that includes Iowa, my home state, where I'm from, Texas, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Idaho, South Carolina, right? But what's really interesting is that these states, the language that they're passing that's anti-CRT doesn't necessarily explicitly say CRT, right? Or critical race theory. What it does is it goes against the concepts of CRT, right? And it bans the discussions, right, around these concepts, right, around discrimination and conscious bias or unconscious bias and oppression, right? So for example, Texas legislation specifically has language that says a teacher may not be compelled to discuss a particular current event or widely debated and currently controversial issue of public policy or social affairs. Pause. Let's take that in. So then how do we engage our students in conversations of the events and things that they're experiencing, like the insurrection on the 6th, right? How do we explain that Juneteenth just became a holiday, right? How do we explain what Juneteenth even is, right? Like, how do we engage our students in all of these discussions, right? But again, there's also the media, right, that plays a role in this. We have this widespread of misinformation and fear-mongering. I think the most recent article I read said that Fox News mentioned CRT more than 1,300 times within a few months, right? So it's like this constant engaging in misinformation. And then for our educators, this means, a lot of times the threat and uncertainty of maybe losing their job, or are they going to become victims of like this mob mentality, and even administrations and school boards, right, are kind of a little afraid to address these things, and all because of this basis of fear, right, and this pushback. And so when we are looking at what do we do, why we're here, right? And I think that brings us to this space because, again, we're educators, right? And this is a teachable moment. So we're here to do what we do. With that, I'm gonna pause and pass it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Dr. Tanya Jaco. Art Nelson Concordia here. I get to coordinate our ethnic studies work down in Santa Barbara Unified. And I just absolutely want to affirm and build off of what Tanya just shared and provide maybe a useful frame for what is happening in the present, because nothing that is happening in the present can really be understood without panning back and looking at the larger historical context of this all. And there's a useful adage, an old adage that I think is in play here, where there's oppression, there is resistance. And I think there's ample evidence of that throughout the history of the United States and well before that. Now, with resistance and all of the gains just from survival to actually being able to push for concrete change in the face of exploitation, dehumanization, that then evokes incredible reaction, right? Where there's resistance, there is inevitably going to be reaction from those who are most threatened by the change. And so in the slide following, I think it would be great for us to, or we'll share a slide in a second, to think of all that is happening now within an understanding of causation, right? And that what is happening now are effects of something that has happened before. And where do we find that before? We find that in history, and that we should be thinking historically, again, when we're talking about attacks on CRT. And that what's going to help us really understand is an analysis of, right, the organized ways, the systems that are really underpinning how we organize and cohere society. And then related to that, like who is in power of these systems? And so as we have this discussion, I think the specifics of school board elections and the move to the right and their ability to win these very local seats of power, and then the policy that comes afterward, I think if we put it in this critical frame, we can organize all of any current issue, right? And in this case, we're looking at CRT. But of course, we're also looking at the attacks on the 1619 project, which is absolutely an example of ethnic studies, attacks on Zin Education Project, and any grassroots efforts to tell a narrative from the perspective of those who are most harmed by systems and inequity and injustice. And so, but before we get into the details of it all, I think this frame can help us have the conversation and then put any example in context so that we're on the same page. So before I get too far ahead, I'll pause there and bring on Dr. Alison Tinchaco-Cubales, so she can chime in as well.
Thank you so much, Tanya, Art, Trisha. We're talking about something heavy, and I want to acknowledge that in our bodies. And in these attacks on CRT and ethnic studies are attacks on us, are attacks on people, are attacks on our communities, are attacks on our legacies, and that's heavy. We can't just talk about all of this in academic terms. Although we're going to spend some time today doing some amazing lesson plans and sharing that all with you, I think we'll just acknowledge the pain, the heavy heart, because these attacks on CRT and ethnic studies are not just symbolic. They're not just acts of xenophobia and hate, which I think a lot of people like to talk about. It really is about people of color being attacked for being people of color. We are grieving as a community. Like every time we go and do one of these workshops, we feel the grief, we feel the heaviness. It's hard. So we come to this table, we come to this Zoom, I think with a lot of heaviness in our hearts. So I just want to acknowledge that before we go into all the things that we can do to respond. I also want to acknowledge, and this is all related to work that I've learned from Art. Art describes these ideas of root causes. And I think really important that we acknowledge that what we're experiencing are seated and founded on ideologies of white supremacy that has plagued this nation since its inception. This is not new. And we must acknowledge, right? Like that's our responsibility to teach that as educators. But if we are being censored and silenced to talk about evidenced history, then it's unconstitutional. So I just want to just kind of set that tone. For many of us, people of color, anti-people of color violence started way before we came to the United States. Colonialism and imperialism are acts of violence that have happened to indigenous people on these lands, and then also in the lands of those of us who are immigrants or those of us who are settlers here. The supremacy and domination that has been imposed on our lands and our bodies, the bodies of our ancestors, is really where the story begins. So it doesn't begin with the CRT or anti-CRT policy. It begins with history. It begins with the root cause of all of this, which is white supremacy. So I'll leave it there for now, because I'm feeling all kinds of stuff. And I want to acknowledge, that I'm coming here with being angry and indignant. And then I'm not seeing myself as victim, right? I'm seeing myself as someone who is a resistor. I'm not accepting that they are pushing us back. Like it is evidenced in our history that it is our responsibility to teach this. So I'll give it back to Trish because I could go on and on about this and we can talk more. There's so much amazing stuff happening today. So I want to acknowledge that we have a lot to do today.
Well, we could just take a few moments because we have about 7 more minutes to talk about that resistance, right? And what we do to respond. So we'll continue with the panel. And so, what has been done to resist that pushback and attack and those attacks, and what can be done, right? For me as a white person, I have a great deal of responsibility to teach my colleagues, my people about what CRT is and the harm that it does, right? And so I'm going to pass it back again to Art Nelson, Tanya, and Allison to talk about that resistance and what that looks like and feels like.
If I could take the first shot at that, I think I want to acknowledge that our presence here in this formation, in this gathering of liberated ethnic studies model curriculum work and pedagogical work, and it is resistance work. And what are we resisting? What is the resistance to? Is the reaction and the external telling by those in power about how we should examine and understand the history of our very own communities. That this was a response to, right, white supremacy telling us what is and how we should understand what our lived experiences are. And so I think, one, our being, and I've heard this statement before, our existence is resistance. And so we are asserting, because we are asserting our self-determination, right? We're asserting our ways of knowing based on our lived experiences, our critical analysis, and our broad, long-standing view of history. And I think what is super important and central to the resistance is that narratives are critical. They absolutely matter. And how people understand what they are experiencing shapes action. And so we elevate that to systems. And if we're looking at school boards, all the way up to state assemblies, all the way up to Congress, their understandings shape the policies that they develop. And so who controls this narrative and who, in their attempt to limit what is discussed, is very telling. And so even more, we need to speak truth to power grounded in our own, right, very, very sacred knowledges, epistemologies, understandings, sensibilities, worldviews, again, grounded in our humanity. And so, again, anything and everything that we experience needs to be seen through the critical frame. And that will allow us, I think, to speak in a very unified way. I'll pause there because I know there's a wealth of knowledge with Tanya and Allison that we need to hear from as well.
Yeah, thank you, Art Nelson. I love how you always frame things for us. Like, I feel like, okay, now I know where to go. But I just think about the very fact that we have legislation that outlaws critical race theory. Does that not illustrate that race is embedded within our legal system? I think that's a question for us to ponder and to really dive into, right? And for us as educators, and I think about this all the time, what is our role in this, right? Like, what is our responsibility? And we are practitioners, right? We're practitioners. We're not here to tell our students what to think, but it is our responsibility to teach them how to think critically. It is our role. It is our moral and ethical responsibility as professional educators, right, to tell the truth and teach them how to think critically, right? And to not do that in any way, shape, or form really is malpractice. right? And we should be held accountable. And I think about that, especially for medical professionals, right? The liability that they have for malpractice, right? And that's kind of the way I see it as well, is that we have a responsibility to tell the truth, and teach our students how to think critically. And every day that we do that is an act of resistance, right? And every day that we do that is the being of resilience, you know, and us being here in this space, developing the curriculum that we're developing, even, you know, at the various levels, whether you're an administrator, you know, our teachers unions have taken firm stances on telling the truth and speaking the truth and teaching the truth, right? Developing policies and advocating, you know, that that we be truth tellers. And then even our act of resilience, you know, I think one of the things too, and Allison mentioned it earlier, right? Like this impact that it has on us. I think us finding joy is an act of resistance, right? And thank you, Lupe, for our cultural energizer, right? This taking moments to find gratitude is an act of resistance and resilience, right? That despite what we have gone through, that we can still be here in this space and still find joy and find gratitude and thanks for one another. But again, we're here to do the work. That's what we're here to do. And us being here in this space, to echo what Art Nelson already mentioned, right, is our act of resilience and how we fight back to continue to tell the truth for justice and liberation.
I don't know if there's much more to say, you know, like in terms of this particular thing. I think there's so much that we're going to share today. I do want to say something that might be controversial, you know, like I think important. That I come from a background of studying Paulo Freire for quite some time, as many as you all are in this space. And so knowing that dehumanization is really what's happening when we experience these attacks. What I've learned from reading Freire over and over is the answer is not dehumanization back. And so I want to humanize the attackers. I want to humanize the people who have imposed violence on our bodies and believe that they're human enough to know that racism is wrong, human enough in their own intuition that belonging is important, but belonging is not assimilation. And so I really believe that to get rid of racism, and I'm hoping that the people who are attacking CRT, attacking ethnic studies, know that racism is fundamentally wrong. It is not human to enact racism. So if we're all on the same page with that, to get rid of anti-Asian, anti-Black, anti-Brown, anti-Arab, anti-Indigenous violence, we must really teach about what happened in history that was wrong. We must teach about the historical and contemporary racism, the injustice that our communities have experienced and fought against for generations. Ethnic studies has been at the forefront of ensuring that our stories, our struggles, our social movements, our solidarity as people of color are being taught in the first person. It's a human right. And if these attackers are human, they need to begin to understand that it's our human right to become self-actualized, to become community actualized. And to be honest, like I've said this in many other settings, and I know some of you have said it too, ethnic studies really saved my life because we were in an educational system that was consistently about the same kind of attacks that we're experiencing now. And ethnic studies is really the only place where I felt true belonging. So I've said this, anti-CRT policies, and I think Lupe said it also in the chat, they are, you know, unexceptionally unconstitutional, and they're censoring our evidence, beliefs, and getting in the way of our racial healing. And we all know in this space, you all came here probably for some racial healing today. For many of us, we believe that education is the key to unlearning the teachings of white supremacy. But to achieve racial justice, we must teach racial injustice and also our resistance and social movements that have combated these acts of violence for generations. So it's important that leaders and policymakers, not just educators, because there's a bunch of educators in here, and I think that that's amazing, and we are going to fight together, but we also need leaders and policymakers to ensure that we as educators have the freedom to teach about race, racism, and resistance, and then we can really talk about belonging.
Well, thank you so, oh, go ahead, Art Nelson.
I was going to say that's what's up, and I have nothing else to add. To achieve racial justice, we must teach about racial injustice. Like there it is, and that is central to ethnic studies.
Thank you so much, Allison, Tanya, and Art Nelson. So now that we have sort of a little bit of a sense of, how we got here and the root of the attacks on CRT and how we resist, let's get into it. Let's talk about what critical race theory is. Let's demystify it. What is it and what is it not? So I'm going to pass it over to Teresa and Lupe.
Right. I am just in awe and so inspired by the panel that I think laid out exactly what we are confronting as we move towards critical race theory. But I also think it's important to understand what are those tenets of critical race theory, so that we can explain it to folks who may be using it as a way to attack ethnic studies but don't know what it is. Next slide. So So as we begin to engage in this process of undoing racial injustice, we acknowledge that there are several forms of structural racism that we are coming up again. And some of the things that you see, the attacks on critical race theory, the attacks on anti-racist education, the attacks on ethnic studies, those are the things that are there right in front of us, right? The resolutions by school board members, the legislative acts that outlaw critical race theory. Those are the blatant racist acts and narratives that each of us face. But critical race theory also acknowledges that there is a whole hell of a lot in terms of structural racism that we don't see. That's much harder, especially for non-people of color, to recognize the historical legacy of racism in this country. And those are everything from those, what I call like piquetitos, right? The little incidents of racial microaggression that people direct at you that aren't really intended to be racist, but cumulatively do damage on your body and your mind and your soul, right? The interconnected institutional policies that abolition is teaching, for example, is ready to undo the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. And the fact that things don't just happen today, but there have been hundreds of years of historical and cumulative impact of race and racism. And that's why we need to talk about it. And then, of course, those unspoken social norms that many of us experience on a regular basis. Next slide. So critical race theory is this interdisciplinary method, or this way of thinking that is just one of the theoretical frameworks used in ethnic studies. We use all kinds of theoretical frameworks in ethnic studies and pedagogical models. Critical race theory is just one. And then within each of our disciplines, there are other theoretical models that apply to the field of Chicano studies or Black studies or Asian American, Pacific Islander studies, et cetera. But in a nutshell, why it's so important and central to ethnic studies is because we are an anti-racist decolonial project. And without the conversation of race, you take out the action part of ethnic studies. And simply what critical race theory argues is that every time our students of color walk out of their door into society, their every single day experience is informed by their encounters with racism, whether they're going to a shopping mall or whether they're in school. And someone using a critical race lens would just basically say, if I really want to fight racism, then I have to have my students embrace who they are, their racialized identity, and that intersectionality with all other forms of their identity. And so what critical race theory says to educators is, okay, it's not just about teaching a subject matter, it's about engaging in a transformational project to undo structural racism. Next slide. So here are the tenets of critical race theory, right? It argues again that race and racism are a part of everyday life for BIPOC communities. It asserts that racism and injustice are not just happenings or incidents like the killing of George Floyd, right? That racism and injustice is a part of a historical trajectory that have been experienced by people of color in the US for a very long time. That we can't undo racism if we do not look at that historical legacy of discrimination and racism and murder and violence. It maintains that who we are today and what we experience, whether we were around during the conquest, right? Whether we were around during slavery, whether we were around during the height of American Indian genocide, that doesn't matter because we are still influenced by those historical experiences as people of color today. And like Art Nelson said, our experience and our lived experiences in the form of truth telling and telling our stories is a part of defying that white supremacy majoritarian outlook, right? That's why folks are so afraid of it, because we are telling our stories, and in framing our counter narratives, we are contradicting what the majoritarian narrative has been. But finally, and probably one of the most important parts of critical race theory for K-12 educators is that it's not just about how we feel and how we speak and how we craft our stories and what we write and what we read, but that we make an explicit commitment to changing this society in thought and in action. And that humanization part that Allison talked about, that we're not just doing it for folks of color, we're doing it for every single person. In a K-12 education, next slide, what we've seen in our work is that except for now, because it's such a hot topic in education, K-12 teachers didn't usually get up and say, well, today we're going to do a lesson on critical race theory, right? What they did is they took those tenets of critical race theory, the pedagogy, or the methodology, and create pedagogical models, many that you're going to see today. They took ideas in critical race theory and made it come alive in the classroom so that students could engage in an anti-racist project. They look at the history of people of color and they connect it to today's experience. They use it to have their students reflect on their own realities as racialized communities, to name the injustice, whatever it be, to discuss it and dialogue, and then to begin to address the trauma that they've encountered with racism. They embrace who they are, right? And the creative and beautiful way that our communities have survived racism by creating a wealth of community cultural knowledge, right? And they use the community cultural knowledge to create that counter narrative. And of course, creating social justice projects that benefit everyone. Next. Some of the methods that you're going to see today, exemplified by our presenters, are the use of community cultural wealth, how the tenets of Tarayoso are used by classroom teachers to uplift the stories of communities of color. Next slide. You're going to see how critical race theory or the development of counter stories are used again to create this resistance model of storytelling that exposes and analyzes and challenges those stereotypes, untruths, deficit stories of racial privilege by having our students speak their truth to counter those narratives. And then, of course, how counter narratives are used to chatter the discourse on race. And you're going to see it not in a theoretical form, but in just one more minute, you're going to see how classroom teachers apply some of these pedagogical models in ways where they don't even mention the word critical race theory, but are doing anti-racist work. Next. So what we see is these three different tenets of critical race theory as models of pedagogy, right? The transformative resistance that you see within the struggle for ethnic studies, right? How teachers use different forms of resistance to move their students into that transformative box where we want our teachers, where we want how we raise questions to uncover those counter narratives. Transformative resistance is central to critical race theory. And now I'm going to pass it to Lupe so that you can see this academic and intellectual messaging of what critical race theory is. From the rest of this session, you're going to see it come alive in our classrooms. Lupe?
And so she's absolutely right. There, in the 22 years of being an educator, I think students had never had heard of critical race theory per se, until, the 1,300 times it was mentioned on Fox News and spread, like all these misinformations were spread online and whatnot. And so absolutely, critical race theory is definitely one of the like philosophical, but also very, real and concrete ways that I create my lessons. So regardless of what I teach, even if I'm mandated to teach something, whatever it may be, what I do is I make sure to do this with it, right? Because this is how you make it relevant to students. This is how you become transformative. This is how your students are where they come into your classroom and then they leave completely changed, and then they become change makers in the world. And so a little of what I do is this notion of the composite counter story, or I use also like a trenza methodology, which also incorporates some of the tenets of CRT. And so a trenza literally is a braid, right? Like braiding different things together. And so I use a lot of storytelling in my classroom, but what is different about the composite counter story or the trenza methodology is that it takes like real stories, but it also braids into it like empirical data or theories or social commentaries. It could even put in there like other literature, statistical data, and it's really powerful. And at another time, I can even go into some actual stories that students have been able to create in the context of certain events, in the context of structures that they're very aware of, that they braid into their story. And so what I'm going to share right now is an actual lesson that I have used with my students before, and that I've facilitated with students before, and it's based on a play called Mojada, a Medea in Los Angeles, written by Luis Alfaro, who is a queer Chicano playwright from, right here in Los Angeles. And it's a really beautiful story that takes the ancient Medea story that talks about migrations in the city-states in ancient Greece, but it sets it in, Michoacan, Mexico, is like the act one sort of. Then there's the journey. And then there's now Boyle Heights, Los Angeles, and the things that Medea and her family go through. And so I start with the cultural energizer, and the cultural energizer should always connect to, what it is that you're trying to do with your lesson. And so this is a this is like a unit, right? This is like a multi-day lesson. So I come in with cultural energizers each time, and I ask questions like, what happens when you live your life for others' dreams? Right. And I figure out really cool ways to scramble students up so that they're able to share that with one another in a way that it isn't like just their seat partner that they're always with. Right. So I literally scramble them up with music, and I have them move around, and then they have to respond. What happens when you live your life for others' dreams? Here's another cultural energizer. When have you felt pressured to deny a part of your identity or ancestry because of pressure from the dominant culture? And I put a scene from this play when it was performed in Oregon at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. This woman here is the woman who plays Medea. And Medea is one who wants to hold on to home culture. She doesn't want to let go of, Michoacan and who she's from, even though she's now in Boyle Heights. And her husband, Hassan, he's one of those that has decided that he will assimilate because he wants, the capitalist American, consumer dream. And here he is like, willing to even, go outside of his marriage, his commitment to Medea in order to achieve that. And so it really helps to like open up students to kind of think about what it is that that happens when those choices are being made, right? And you always do critical concepts. So this is like with Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, our format is, we have a format and we bring in critical concepts. So here are some of the critical concepts I bring into this particular lesson. Issues of gentrification and just really like not just gentrification as this like boogie person, right? But like actually what it is, what it looks like, the long process, right? We know that gentrification doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, right? That takes sometimes 20, 30 years to happen. And the students get to really know a lot about that, including redlining, learning about, that background knowledge about what redlining is in this particular area where the play is set, which is actually where I teach. I want students to understand like how the community came to look like what it looks like now, and why it is that the conditions that they're experiencing are occurring, at that time. Some other critical concepts is central city disinvestment and investment patterns, right? Because these are things that students have nothing to do with, but yet have a direct impact on them. And then they start to believe that, that they are responsible for, that there's something wrong with them, right? And so all of this really like learning all of these structural issues really helps to kind of free them from that, right? So that they can understand that it isn't that there's something wrong with my family, that we can barely pay the rent, right? They get to have that concrete information about what it is that's causing these conditions. Some other critical concepts that are really important in this context is like the notion of community, the notion of counter narrative, what is cultural retention, what is migration, what is curanderismo, right? In the play, there's a curandera character named Tita, and a lot of our students, regardless of their ethnic background, have connections to, healers, right? And so they this gives them an opportunity to feel connected to some of these characters. It's just really beautiful. And then so this is a play. So in some cases, if you have the resources, right, and the know-how, you can put on a full-on production for your school, for your community, bring in the community. In this case, I have pictures here where I did a reader's theater style in my classroom, right? So here I am, I think I was Tita, so I was the curandera. And then these students sitting here are the ones that performed it in the class for the class. And so what I did is I just put their, the names of the character here. to keep it clear. And then the students, as you can see, like right over here on this angle at the table, they're doing two things while we're performing. They're reading the play, but they're also responding to certain things about the performance and also about certain themes, so that it keeps everybody really active in what we're trying to do with the themes and concepts and the liberation project of reading this really powerful play. So that's one activity or one lesson that I've done. Here's another example. And in this example, this is one that I did take it to that next level, where I took it to that performance in the community level. And so I want to kind of, before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about what it is. It is a multimedia folk opera community production. If you notice here, I put M migration, and I did that for a couple of reasons. One is, even though the borders exist, they don't really exist. So I really like, with my students to talk about like that we're migrating, right? It's very natural to migrate. And so I do that for that purpose, but I also put, migration, because some students, depending on where you teach, they may not have access to generations of history, right? They go back to actual cross, country migration. And so I give them the opportunity to talk about like maybe if they left, one city to another city or a state to another state, or even like a house on one block to a house in a different part of the city, so that it gives them an opportunity to be able to partake in the activity, even if they don't have the access to that, international migration experience. And so this production is multimedia. So I brought in community members that I know who have a band, right? So Cuñao, and you're gonna hear the music of a live band being played. I brought in my friends who are poets, right? And they help students write poetry. And I'm gonna show you the structure of that poem in a second about their migration experiences. Because some students they're not really like poets, right? They may not see themselves as poets, but they like art. So I brought in my artist friend to create art that did the same thing, but just in a visual art form as opposed to poetry. You're gonna see shadow puppets, because we brought in One Grain of Sand Puppet Theater. You're gonna see large puppets, because the puppet theater has, they use large puppets. They also use like marionette puppets, and they also use shadow puppets. And so we taught the students how to partake and tell their story in any of these ways. And so what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna show you a clip of one of the shadow puppet productions that the students helped to perform in. And so when I start this video, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to click on the auto translation, which is like from YouTube for those who don't speak Spanish. The song is in Spanish. I just want to warn you in advance that the translation is like automatic. It's not going to be like good translation. So give me 1 second so I can set that up for you all so that you can, so that you can read what the subtitles actually are. So give me 1 second to turn those on. Subtitles, just give me a second, Spanish. When you share your screen, everything gets a little bit more difficult. Okay. Translate English. Okay, let's go ahead and start this now.
La cara fría, sale el sol y el nuevo día trae con sí la posibilidad de dejar la pesadilla atrás, de alcanzar un sueño al despertar y con la frente en alto andar. Jugo, pan y ave marías, madres suben con sus crías a la troca sin mirar atrás. Las palabras quedan y además el horizonte brinda su calzar y el desierto a caminar. Y no hay refugio del intenso María, la comida de mi madre y el rosario que me dio. Porque estoy listo para cruzar, porque estoy listo para cruzar, porque estoy listo para cruzar, mi nueva vida comenzar. Pasan horas, pasan días, pasan hambre y noches frías, pasan pero no pueden cruzar. Las palabras quedan y además el desierto viene a reclamar su tarifa que es mortal. Y no hay refugio del intenso sol, labios cortados, secos, sabor a dolor. Que alguien encuentre escrita esta canción para que le cuenten a mis padres por el rumbo que fui yo. Y ahora estoy listo para soñar, porque estoy listo para soñar, porque estoy listo para soñar en lo que pudo y no será.
So that is an example of a production, a piece of a multimedia production that we presented for students and for the community. And if you're interested in seeing this production again, we're actually going to perform it at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Los Angeles on December 18th. So we can get information to you about that. But let me show a little bit more of this multimedia production. What you see here are some of the art pieces that I was telling you about. So for students who, are not, poets, like, because we all have our talents, right? We all can share our stories in our own ways. We had students create these retablos that were part of a procession that takes the students on to begin the performance and off. It's like a posada. And so what was really beautiful about that is that we brought the community in. So parents were invited to come in and be a part of that. And it was really beautiful because it's their story that their children was telling anyways, right? And so to bring them in was really, really powerful. And so I'm gonna show, this is a super short clip here. This is actually the exit procession that once we did the whole multimedia presentation, they were able to like kind of welcome, or the despedida, I don't know how to say that, the opposite of welcome folks out of the performance. So here you go. Let's check this out real quick. So something that's important to note about that is that by having the band there, we're elevating the stories, right? We're producing them, we're publishing them, we're sharing them with the world. So it doesn't, even if it was just an assignment for the class, right? That's still powerful, giving the students the opportunity to share their story. But the fact that we're elevating it as a fine art was transformative. And some of the students in that video are students who are, have been reluctant in other classes, and now they're participating, they're sharing their stories, they're showing up to school to rehearse, and they're still asking me if they can do this. Like almost every week I get kids come up to me and say they want to do this, but with the COVID restrictions, we're still not quite there. And so what I'm going to do here, I'm going to show a very short clip of another part of this multimedia production, which was the students presenting their 3-act poems. And I'll go into the structure of how the assignment incorporated Matt Cedillo's 3-act poem concept. And so this particular student is sharing his story of a strong Guatemalan man, which is his father.
The story of a strong Guatemalan man. Guatemala, a beautiful, peaceful place of rich environment and lively people that my dad grew up with for as long as he can remember. A country that I wish I knew more from my dad. A country where my dad was born and raised by his mother and father.
Okay, so his poem goes on for 7.5 minutes, but once again, the fact that the students were able to perform their poetry for the community with a band as their kind of their background music was really, really powerful. And this student here is a student who, is an English learner, right? He was a reluctant public speaker. And here he is dressed up in his suit, so proud to share his father's story. And so let me show you, I'm going to show you this is based on what Matt Cedillo, the poet laureate of the Chicano people here in LA. This is his format. He's actually the one that came in and helped me take the students' stories and turn them into the 3-act poem. So the 3-act poem can be organized in any way with an act 1, 2, and 3. But what we did was we had the students kind of research the background of the material, historical, and political conditions of the place that they were from or their family ancestors migrated from. Then act 2 was the conditions of the journey, right? Which is different for every single kid, depending on where they came from. And, some folks, had, access to documents. Some folks came in the back of a trunk. I mean, there was all sorts of different stories. And then number 3 was the material, historical, political conditions of life today. And so what we did was we tried to help them see a common thread that became that metaphor. So one of my students was from Honduras, and one of the things that she really missed in Honduras was these posadas that they did in her village, right? And so what she ended up doing was using that extended metaphor of the journey being like a posada, and then what, now that she's in Los Angeles, what it was that connected her to Honduras still. And so what we do in the conclusive dialogue is we have them really think about what are improvements that you've experienced after going through this migration? What stayed the same? What is worse? So they do that analysis with that, with their conclusive dialogue. These are some of the liberated ethnic studies guiding values and principles that are used for this Canción del Inmigrante project. And then now I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Teresa. Thank you.
What I think is so powerful about this particular lesson and the ones that you're going to see later on this afternoon is exactly what we've been saying. That when you look at what Lupe did, right, she did not say, I am applying critical race theory to this lesson. But what she did is she used the experiential knowledge of her students to frame their marginalization and oppression in such a way that it raised the community cultural wealth of the community, right? So the students were looking at their immigrant stories. They were creating puppets to tell a story about the journey of immigrants into this country, right? They centered their racialized selves in this process of creating a beautiful production that also celebrated how we as a people survive in a racist society. And that's what critical race theory does. Let me recognize who I am, how I survive, and tell the story in such a way that you will embrace it. It was a human story in this production. And I think it's important to recognize that this can be done at any age. Right? Critical race theory and stories about race and racism can happen at any age because children at a very young age begin to learn racial stereotypes. They begin to think about who I am, and they are not colorblind, and they are not silent, and they are not muted about these conversations. In fact, many ask questions. Next slide. So if we do not do this, this is not just something that impacts communities of color. It impacts the entire society. Imagine a society where we began to engage our young children in conversations about race and racism. In a supportive family with a strong, healthy community, even if you have the wealthiest family with all of their basic needs met, it doesn't mean that those children don't recognize race or racism. If you silence it, it becomes more negative. Racism has an impact on the healthcare of racial groups and communities impacted by racism. That's why we have high blood pressure. That's why we have incidence of diabetes. That's why we have we see in communities of color the stress that racism has on your body. Having that conversation early helps that community survive. There are, right after the shooting in El Paso, there was a research done by the American Pediatric Association that looked at, that tried to collect stories of adults who had witnessed racism. They were not the recipients or the targets of the racist act. They simply witnessed these acts as young children growing up. And they retold their story. And in retelling their story, what was evidenced by the research is that that incident, what they saw, the impact of that was equal to that of a first responder. So imagine what it's like for a young person who has experienced racial profiling, right? Deficit thinking in a classroom. That impact is much, much stronger. We do this in ethnic studies. Next slide. We uncover these stories in a way that empowers, and that next slide, we can send this to folks about what it does. Final slide. We use anti-racist curriculum and teaching methods as a way for schools to promote a just and improved society for our students of color. We know that when ethnic studies is done well, it has an increased graduation rate, attendance, and students are more likely to go to college. Ethnic studies is more than pedagogy and content. Ethnic studies is about creating change in the community. And what you witness in Lupe's tale and what you will see in the lessons that follow are how classroom teachers begin to use critical race theory connected to ethnic studies in a way to empower and to create social justice activists out of our students.
Thank you so much, Lupe and Teresa. What a beautiful lesson, as we can see in the chat, and ways to connect it with theory, Teresa. So thank you so much. I know that's a lot of information. We want to give you a moment to breathe, get outside, take care of yourselves. So what we'd like you to do is go ahead and step out for 10 minutes. And if you can return at 10:30, Lupe will play a little bit of music for us. And please walk around, take a deep breath, do some of your Saturday things, and we'll see you back at 10:30.
Jumped up again. You tried like we did before. We've attended your bias schools, and we live by your rules. Pretend we're being fooled, but don't tell me that we're fighting to be free when we're living in your ghettos. Think you got us on our knees. Hey, don't you know, from horizon to horizon, there's an angry giant rising. You're no longer fooling me. My friend, we jumped up again. You've tried, but we won't give in. You lied from your marble halls while you build your walls, your immoral walls. So don't you preach equal opportunities when you lock our kids in cages and they're crying to be free. Hey, don't you know, from horizon to horizon, there's an angry giant rising. You're no longer fooling me. My friend, we've jumped up again.
In the year 1970, the city of San Diego, under the Coronado Bridge, lied a little piece of land. A piece of land that the community of Logan Heights wanted to make into a park. A park where all the chavalitos could come and play in, so they wouldn't have to play in the street anymore and get run over by a car. A park where all the viejitos could come and just sit down and watch the sun go down in the tarde. A park where all the familias could come and just get together on a Sunday afternoon and celebrate the spirit of life itself. But the city of San Diego said, chale, we're gonna make a highway patrol substation here, man. So on April the 22nd, 1970, La Raza of Logan Heights and other Chicano communities of San Diego got together and they organized and they walked on the land and they took it over with their picks and their shovels and they began to build their park. And today, that little piece of land under the Coronado Bridge is known to everybody as Chicano Park. It began in 1970 under the Coronado Bridge en mi barrio in San Diego, where my people began to fight for Chicano Park, for Chicano Park, under the bridge, under the bridge, under the bridge. We shall continue to live, my brother. We shall continue to fight, my friend. We shall continue to live, my brother. We shall continue to fight, my friend. For Chicano Park, under the bridge.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to get some fresh air. What we'd like to do now is go straight into our lessons, looking at critical race theory in the K-12 classroom. And as was mentioned before by many folks, you may not see it by name, CRT, but definitely is part of that Trenza methodology that you will see. It'll be woven into the work that we are doing. So we're actually going to jump into a lesson that Dr. Tanya Jaco and I worked on together. And I'm super excited to share it with you today. And it's entitled See It, Name It, Change the Game, Understanding Systems of Oppression and Taking Action to Change the Game. And I'll pass it to Tanya to introduce herself.
All right, good morning, welcome back. I'm looking forward into jumping into this lesson with you all. We're really just gonna try to highlight, so we're gonna go back and forth between kind of wearing our educator hat and then allowing you to be the student a little bit as we walk through this lesson that we might do in our unit on systems, right? I want you to just take a moment, right? We engage our students in lots of conversations, and one of them, sometimes we have to engage them in uncomfortable conversations or guiding them through and creating space for them to process maybe some challenges and things that they're not quite sure how to articulate, right? And so we want to first make sure that we have created the community and taken the time to build the space in the classroom where students feel safe and where they can kind of engage and take these kind of academic risks. I want you to think about, though, as we're going through this or as we get ready to get started, you know, have you ever had an experience, right? Or how would you describe a moment where you just knew something wasn't right? but you couldn't quite articulate it, right? You didn't necessarily have the language. And so that's kind of to frame our conversation going forward for today. We would typically start with the cultural energizer. We're gonna kind of move through that, but maybe starting with having students, and you can even think about this, right? Like, how would you describe the rules and objective to your favorite game without using its name, right? All right, with that said, we are going to jump in. We're going to be using our text. There's a Netflix limited series on Netflix called Colin in Black and White. And I really love that he is telling his story from his first person experience in high school, some of his high school experiences. So let's just take a look at kind of an overview of what we're getting ready to come into.
Life puts us on a path, sometimes narrow, sometimes winding, but always ours. When we're young, we're told that the world is ours, that we should figure out our path and take our shot. Then one day, we realize that the game we're playing is someone else's. In this game, we can't speak our truth. In this game, it feels like the only choice we have is theirs. But we can change the game. We can write new rules, radiate our joy, take back our power, and find our purpose. That's our path. Believe in your path. And by doing that, we can become who we're destined to be.
All right.
So the content of this lesson is the film, right? And so through watching clips in the film, what we want students to be able to do is to identify and define 3 characteristics of white supremacy. And in response to that, this idea of resistance that we opened up this session with is brainstorming ways to cultivate community, right? In relation to that white supremacy that we identify. So the essential question is, in what ways can we reimagine new possibilities for our communities, right? That transcend, that transform white supremacy. And as you can see on the right, this lesson hits many standards in English language arts and literacy, and even more so. There's so many ways to extend. You'll find that in creating ethnic studies lessons that it's very easy to meet standards because they're so rich and they're so engaging and ask us to engage in so many analyses of critical analyses of texts. Okay, so what is white supremacy culture? And just like you can see in the image there, for white folks like me, it's very, very hard to recognize that it's there. And you'll also see in our text, which is Colin's counter narrative, his story, is that for him, he was aware of it, but even his parents were not, right? Because they've been swimming in this culture, it becomes invisible to them. So it is a form of racism, and it's centered on this idea that white folks are actually better than everyone else, superior to people from other backgrounds. And that white people should just naturally, politically, economically, and socially dominate non-whites.
All right, so let's take a look. We're going to watch a short clip. It's about 5 minutes. But as you watch, I want you to think about who and what do you relate to, if any, right, in this scene? How does it make you feel? And you'll notice that there's this rule. And I want you to think about, do you think the rule is fair? Why or why not? And I just want to make sure, can you see the video on my screen? Okay, cool. So we're going to go back and we're going to pause right there, right? So I want to put the questions before you again one more time. Was the rule fair? Do you think the rule was fair? All right, and what we're going to do right now as well is we're going to share a Padlet, a link in the chat with you. You can also, if you have your phone, you can scan or you can type in the short link at the bottom. There are different sections. So once you get there, I'll pop over in just a moment. You can, just here on the first clip number 1, you're going to click the plus sign and you can just add your thoughts. You don't have to type the subject. You can just write something right here to give your thoughts. We'll take a few minutes to do that. Do you think the rule was fair? Why or why not? And it doesn't look like, let's see if I can just drop the link again. Sorry, doesn't look like it's a link. There you go, that should work. Again, if you have, you can always scan the QR code or type the link or click the link in the chat. And I'll play a little music as we get started. Take a couple minutes. Yep, just the first question, just for clip number 1. Do you think the rule was fair? Why or why not?
It ain't hard to tell. I excel, then prevail. The mic is contact that I attract clientele. My mic check is life or death, breathing a sniper's breath. I exhale the yellow smoke over through righteous steps, deep like the shining, sparkle like a diamond, sneak on the island, and my army jacket lining hit the earth like a comet invasion. Nazis like the Afro-Centric Asian, half man, half amazing. Cause in my principle, I can express through song, delete stress like more trend and extend strong. I drink my wet with Medusa, give us ash tons of hell from the tip that I lived in hell. It ain't hard to tell. Turn the bass up, not stories by Aesop. Play salute up, parties I shoot up. Nines I analyze, drop a jewel. Inhale from the lab school full well. You feel it like Braille, it ain't hard to tell. I kick a skill like Shaquille holds a pill. Vocabulary spills, I'm ill. Plusmatic, I freak beat, slam it like Iron Sheik. Jam like a heck with correct techniques. So analyze me, surprise me, but can't magnetize me. Scanning while you're planning ways to sabotage me. I'll leave a froze like alright in your nose. Nines I rock well, it ain't hard.
All right, as you continue to type on the Padlet, I just want to share some thoughts and have Trish add in too. You know, as far as Trish, do you think the rule was fair? What were some of the things that you noticed?
Well, absolutely not. And I think the thing that made it most difficult was this idea that Colin's parents wouldn't even answer his question. Like, who made the rule? Does it exist? Where is it? And then he asked directly, will you come to my defense of my chosen hairstyle? And they said no. And you had to pick, you know, either baseball or your hair. So it is very painful to watch.
Yeah. And I mean, that was, and as someone actually, you know, who is biracial, right? Having these experiences where you recognize and you notice where Colin wasn't aware, right, of this rule. All of a sudden, this rule just popped up, right? It just all of a sudden magically appeared, and his parents reinforced this rule as well. We're going to keep going, right? You can go ahead and continue to add in the chat, right? But we want to make sure that we're able to cover. We're going to dive into some vocabulary. We oftentimes, again, have things that we experience, but we don't really know how to explain them. And so we want to start to be able to see them, but also name them so that we can later change the game.
And I would say also, as a white person, understanding the language of identifying white supremacy is important for us because it has become so invisible to us, right? Because it doesn't inconvenience me, doesn't make my life more difficult. In fact, it helps me, all these aspects of white supremacy. So these terms help me identify these white supremacy characteristics within myself, right? So I can stop them. So paternalism is one that comes out in this clip very strongly. And again, this idea And I think paternalism, I think father, right? Traditional father, this is the rule and that's it, you know, and it's in your best interest. And I'm not going to tell you why, but you know, I'm in power, I'm in charge, and I make the decisions, and it's for your best. So in this example, again, Colin is told, don't question that authority, don't question the rule. The coaches have supreme authority over this. You don't get to know how the rules were made. Another aspect of white supremacy that is shown in this clip is defensiveness. And we see this all the time among white folks and white supremacy, that our actions and structures protect our power and our people, right? And any kind of criticism I see as a personal attack, as opposed to a criticism of the structure. So Colin's parents ignore his questions, as we talked about before, and refuse to protect him and protect the baseball coaches, really, in their power. And with this harmful, painful, violent word for their own child, thug. And then finally, another aspect of white supremacy, and there'll be many others, but these are the ones that sort of came out strongly, I think, for me, is this idea of either or thinking is an aspect of white supremacy. Things can be only A or B, and when you have A and B, one is always better than the other, right? So it's baseball or don't play, look like a thug or don't, cut your hair or lose everything, choose, you know, who you are or embrace what society perceives as normal. Either or thinking, one's better, one's worse.
Yeah. And I think it's also, I just want to add on really quickly with understanding these characteristics, right? That we are identifying the characteristics of white supremacy, which doesn't mean that we're saying all white people are racist, right? That these are characteristics that anyone can perpetuate. And it is our duty to understand and be able to identify so that we don't perpetuate these characteristics and we don't perpetuate these systems. All right, in this next clip, we're going to show one more clip. I want you to think about, so thinking about those vocabulary words and now looking, having those words and being able to identify them and seeing them in this next scene. Let's go ahead. All right, so we're going to go back to our Padlet one more time. And really think about, can you, in just doing this, and you know, it might take a little more time, right? We're moving kind of quickly, right? But identifying a quote, right? Or a description of where you see in this scenario defensiveness, paternalism, or this either or thinking, or other characteristics for those of you who may know what the other characteristics are. And as you are typing, so let's go back here. So now you're going to go to clip 2. Do we need to drop the link one more time? Okay, Trish got it. Thanks, Trish. And you're going to add here any quote or description of defensiveness. And as you're typing, if I'm just talking out loud for you, one of the things that I noticed, right away, right? When he just asserted himself of, you know, like, hey, that's not a compliment, right? There was this immediate defensiveness, like you don't need to, and then there was this, you know, ascribing, right? You don't need to get angry, right? It's like, whoa, wait a minute, right? Like he's already positioning himself to make Colin the problem, right? And make Colin the issue, right? Instead of acknowledging that what he said was offensive. Right. And, you know, and just putting a little more context, this, you know, obviously they're traveling for baseball and they're going to hotels while they're traveling as teams. And Colin is always identified in the lobby that's full of predominantly white boys as being someone that's problematic. And in this particular instance, there was another team that was predominantly a Black team that had been kicked out of the hotel before, which is why he said, well, you're one of the good ones. You're not like those other guys that they perceived. Trish, did you want to add anything on here?
Sure, and I dropped in the chat those definitions again to help you. Yeah, I mean, the obvious either or thinking is that you're either good or bad as a Black person, right? Or white is good and Black is bad, right? Those binaries, which is a part of colonialism and neo-colonialism, is that either or binaristic thinking. Because with all these binaries, it's always a hierarchy. One is better than the other, right? This simplistic thinking. And, you know, the hotel worker is really abusively wielding his power, right? By demanding that he get out of the pool. And also that threat, be careful. just thrown in there. Be careful, right? Why was that necessary to say? And, you know, again, the hotel worker is completely unconcerned with Colin's viewpoint. And, you know, he thinks that his compliment is in the best interest of Colin. So there's that paternalism that's pervasive, right? That he's that fish in the bowl and doesn't recognize. So he needs to understand this vocabulary as well.
Yeah, so these are the things that we don't always see, right? We experience them and we recognize that they don't feel good, something doesn't quite seem right, but we're not really sure what to call it or how to identify it, right? This is the covert white supremacy. This is the way that white supremacy oftentimes shows up in our communities and our schools and our policies, our practices, even within our day-to-day culture. So if we were in class, we would take some time to kind of walk through and, you know, and go all the way through with these examples. We're going to kind of switch gears at this moment for our purposes here. We want you to think about, where have you seen and or experienced these characteristics, right, in your everyday life, right? Paternalism, defensiveness, either or thinking, right? And just some examples. And again, you can add them to the Padlet this when we get there. But an example of this, right? Student or the teacher calls out inequities, and then they become the target, right? They're seen as problematic. They're seen as not following the rules, or seen as being defiant, or creating a hostile work environment, right? Like that is an example of a characteristic of white supremacy, right? How the system will defend itself. We might see this in power struggle with students, right? Where take out a pencil or you're getting detention, right? Where is that a rule? Where is that a policy, right? That the educator then has the ability to, again, yield their power and start to, again, get into this either or, and I'm right because I'm right. Right? We might see this definitely in school dress code policies, right? Grading policies, teacher bias and who they call on, right? These are just a few examples of where we see these characteristics of white supremacy showing up in our schools. But we don't want to stay here, right? So I want you to maybe think about some of the ideas that you have, and then we're going to brainstorm. Trish, do you want to talk a little bit about this part?
Sure. So, you know, what are some of these responses you could have to white supremacy, right? How could have Colin's parents responded differently to Colin? Could they have gone and talked to the coaches and said, hey, you know, this is just a hairstyle. You know, I'm not seeing this as a rule. You know, what is it about his hair in particular that bothers you? And talk about the other kids' hair and show the bias that might be there. So it's just so important to, you know, find ways to respond that would be improvements upon those responses that happened in the clip. So if you can think of examples of ways that the hotel clerk or the parents or in the school, in the community, when it comes to dress codes or calling on students or power struggles, this idea that I know better and I don't have to tell you why, I don't have to tell you the rules of the game because, you know, I know, but because I'm right, because I'm supreme, I'm better than you, right? You don't ask me why. This is just how it is. So what are some ways that we could cultivate new possibilities and responses to that? Imagine new ways of engaging that sort of disrupt this defensiveness and these power struggles related to paternalism and knowing better and either or thinking, right? Would there be an option between, you know, having to leave baseball and cutting your hair? What is another way? What's a third way? What's a fourth way?
Yeah. And so you all get the idea, right, of where we would go. But for our purposes, we're just going to wrap up and kind of walk through, right? So for example, what we might do with students, walking them through, right? So taking this example of another characteristic, perfectionism, right? That making mistakes are confused with being a mistake, right? Doing wrong with being wrong, right? And there's little time or no time at all for any reflection or identifying lessons learned, right? We're just telling them you're wrong, you're bad, you can't do this, right? So in our world, we want to imagine new possibilities. So we want students to come up with, and for example, we want to create a classroom where mistakes are expected, that they're valued, and that there are opportunities for learning, right? And that we want to affirm that we believe in making time to reflect, to learn from our mistakes, right? So this would be an example of taking this characteristic. Now, how do we want to transform it, right? Another one.
So we are actually out of time, and I don't want to take away from the other lessons. So, but we have, examples of how to, instead of being defensive, right, or being paternalistic, there's new possibilities there. What I'd like to do is just move to slide 53 and just share with you a resource that we put together on white supremacy culture. I'm going to drop in the chat for you. And what it has there are some of those new possibilities for each of those that we had to skip over those slides. There are, I don't know if you can go to the document, Tanya. It's in the notes in the chat. So it's a forced copy, so you can use this in your classroom, you can modify it, it can be used for any text, right? And it has the link to the different white supremacy characteristics that we've been talking about, and ways to imagine new possibilities. So we hope you just take this this document and apply it in your classroom and start talking about white supremacy, naming it so we can change the game, right? So if we know the rules, who makes the rules? This can be used with films, texts, poems. Kids could walk around with clipboards at the school and check off white supremacy they notice. There's a ton of possibilities. So I want to end it there. Tanya, any last thoughts before we pass it over to Jeffrey?
No, again, we just want to say it's important to engage in these kind of uncomfortable conversations, but also providing the academic space for students to develop the language, to start to articulate what they're already experiencing, right? That was one of the things with Colin, is he was kind of having these moments, but he had no one to support him or to help him to see that this is in fact wrong and what you're feeling is not right. And here's actually what it's called, but then here's also what you can do to change, to improve. So that's ultimately the goal.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we'll pass it over to Jeffrey for another amazing lesson. And Jeff, I think you're doing your own slides, yes?
Yeah, yeah. If you could just allow me to share my screen. All right, perfect. There we go. Okay. All right, excellent. What do I have till 11:30? All right, we'll make it work. Okay, I'm gonna put my email in the chat, right? And we hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation, right? I know we're definitely super appreciative of all y'all making it out here on a Saturday. I know the school year has been crazy, but it speaks volumes to just share this space with educators, despite everything that's happening. And I know for me, that is rewarding, keeps me inspired as well. So definitely reach out anytime you have more questions, right? Just to stay connected. Let me know what's working in your space as well. I'm also going to share the document, so we could kind of work off of that. This unit or this lesson really reflects a unit. So it's about it could be 2 to 3 weeks worth of work, and we'll condense it down into this half hour. But you could always come back to them and let me know. I mean, this is what I would use in my class. This is what I do use in my class. So if you open up that link and let me know if it opens or if it doesn't, it should. I just kind of keep all my work just on one document. So we'll kind of be working through this together. You don't have to get through all of it. We won't today, but just so you know, in terms of how it would look in an ethnic studies class, predominantly in a high school setting. Okay. All right. So starting us off, right, the focus is on community cultural wealth, right? And how do we grow more roses, identifying and utilizing the cultural capital in our lives and communities, right? So in the chat, just in terms of what are images, thoughts, ideas, what do we know about Tupac so far? What do we know about Tupac so far? And we could just put that in the chat, something that you recognize about Tupac, something you want to celebrate or honor, something you're confused about, right? Whatever you know about Tupac, we could just throw that in the chat. Or if you want to be brave and call it out, you all could do that too. All right, and we'll take about, let's say just a minute or two, just to kind of share some thoughts, ideas. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Asus, Poet. Thank you, Kelly. All right. Thank you, Trisha, Mariana. Thank you. The sensitivity. Awesome, Cindy. Thank you. Oops. Okay. All right. Excellent. These look really, really good, right? And I know in terms of just bringing Tupac into our classroom spaces, we're attempting to just highlight, right, to demonstrate to students that what they know, their experiences, their expertise is applicable to these curriculums, these ideas that sometimes feel very distant from them originally, right? But they do bring with them, right, a wealth of information. And we just got to sometimes demonstrate the tie-ins, right? And Tupac is one of those. I know for me, I used to DJ, right, coming through kind of the hip hop era. And sampling, I was always amazed by, right? And hopefully today, you'll be able to kind of sample from these lessons as well, right? Not that we're expecting y'all to use all of these lessons, right? But the fact that you'll have them available, right? And hopefully wanting to try some, right? And then sharing some of yours at a later date as well, right? This is in terms of how we build. So I know just that song, right? Tupac is Changes. He samples Bruce Hornsby. And kind of just reminding students in terms of that, right? How we could kind of build from these ideas, even if they're minute or small, right? So for Tupac, when we talk about Tupac, we got to talk about folks who are around him who kind of nurtured his growth and development, right? And people who provided his needs, right? And we can't get there without kind of talking about his mom and the role she played in helping politicize and teach him in terms of these critical concepts as well. Afeni Shakur. He would go to, right, Baltimore School of the Arts. We'll just give some background, right? Just some pictures. We see him as a youth, right? And there, in terms of at the school, he was somewhat allowed to tap into like an artistic side. He talks about taking ballet, things like that. Transferred, moved around a lot, ended up at Marin City in Mount Tam. There's these clips, they're available. You could always click on those. And he connects with Digital Underground, right? Shock G just passed away recently too. But he was a roadie with them. And it's with them that he kind of gets signed, I guess, through one of their singles, Same Song, right? But as a teenager, one of the things I really appreciate and remind the youth is just appreciating his work ethic. The dude just put out a ton of stuff, right? And one of the things he left us with was this book on poetry. And it's rad because if you find the book, you can find it anywhere. A lot of you own it already, which is great. But it shows like the written text and then it shows kind of his own words, right? So we have this poem, right? The rose that grew from concrete. Just in terms of inviting more spaces into the room, does anybody want to read this for us?
I can read it.
Okay, perfect.
The rose that grew from concrete, autobiographical. Did you hear about the rose that grew from a crack in the concrete? Proving nature's laws wrong, it learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else even cared.
Beautiful, beautiful. Excellent, you read it well. Right, so in that autobiographical piece, right, we could look at more of, you could definitely use more of his text, right? But we kind of started there, getting to in terms of just analyze the poem, the title, an image, wanting the students to think in imagery, a line that stood out to them, and then something that connected with them as well. Right, working through a discussion, you could talk about what stood out to you in the poem. What does the rose symbolize? And then what is a concrete in their lives? How do they keep their dreams intact? So just in terms of celebrating the work y'all have done so far, right, in this school year, we said it's like no other. Just putting in the chat, what is something that you want to celebrate, how you are as a
What happened?
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see that. All right. If you could just put in the chat something you've done well this year, how your practice, your classroom, something that you want to honor and celebrate. I know it's been a crazy year, but if you could just put in the chat something that has gone well for you, big or small, so far in this school year, just as educators. My students trust me. Awesome. Thank you, Trisha. Okay, other folks, just things that have gone well, my students, excellent. Awesome, Jesus, thank you. Okay, perfect, Ricky. All right, show up and teach. Thank you, Brian. Awesome. That is great. Connecting in person, excellent. Okay, not easy. Thank you, Kelly. All right, and I know for me, right, just being in these shared spaces with other educators as well, right, is huge. Okay, so for us, right, we would kind of, good, no worries, you made it, right? You're jumping into the profession. All right, so how do we grow more roses, right? What is needed in our lives to kind of nurture our own growth and development, right? And we could kind of parallel this poem with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where he talks about the physiological safety, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization, right? To talk about nurturing our own growth, right? And then we could get into the discussions around how racism begins to impede this growth, right? And when we talk about it with our students, right, they come with a lot of the buy-ins and the mindsets that racism is centered around beliefs, right? And CRT helps us illustrate that it moves beyond that, right, to the practices and policies, systems and structures, right, inherent in our institutions, like our schools, like our environment. Okay, and then we want to remind students that the one thing that Maslow is missing, right, is at the top, which would be coming back to one's community, right, giving back, supporting one another in the work that we do. All right, so from there, right, diving into Yoso's article, Whose Culture Has Capital, a critical race theory discussion of community wealth. And that racism continues to influence our institutions and both policies, practices, and beliefs. In schools, we see this emerge with the assumptions of students of color as lacking, right, the social and or capital to move upward within the academic setting. Right. And I'll kind of breeze through these, but the slides are there, right? And you could always access them as well, right? But the deficit models, the issue is that it places the blame on the students and families for their underperformance, right? That the students enter the school sites lacking or without adequate knowledge and skills to succeed. Parents' cultures are not invested in the academic success of their child, and as a result, it's up to the schools, educators to fill these students with the knowledge deemed relevant to succeed in a school setting, right? And then we're left with Freire's banking model of education, right? Where the attempt to fill these students. Right? Let's work these. All right. I'll skip over some of these. All right, so the deficit models assert that the reasons for the disparities, right, is because of the inherent flaws within the individual or group, right? It is assumed that they lack the cultural capital to move up or towards the dominant ideas of success, right? And we see a lot of this in our classrooms, right, as educators. I know working at an alternative or continuation setting, a lot of times when we attempted to have discussions in class, right, if I didn't structure them well enough, that the students sometimes didn't see the significance or importance in terms of sharing or listening to other people's stories. And sometimes it wasn't until we got to a textbook that they dove into the material because they assumed that that's where the real learning was happening, right? So working against those trends, right, not only in our classrooms, but in terms of the mindsets, the approaches, right, that have been imposed on our students. Right, so for many marginalized groups or individuals, their culture is diminished as they're expected to leave it at home. Their culture, expertise, and experiences are not seen as worthy, relevant, or important, right, as lacking and deficient. And they never seek to address the inherent system and structures that work to marginalize and underserve these communities. Right, so depending on where you want to go with this lesson, right, you could spend more time in terms of Freire's piece, right, if you wanted to get into that text around his banking concept of education, how it's bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. The teacher presents himself to his students as their necessary opposite. By considering their ignorance absolute, he justifies his or her own existence, right? But Tupac, right, and once again, bridging these gaps, talks about it as well. And though he doesn't use the language, right, Teresa talked about this, he's in essence talking about these same things, right? You try to plant something in the concrete, if it grows, and the rose petal got all kind of scratches and marks, you're not going to say, damn, look at all those scratches and marks on the rose that grew from concrete. You're going to be like, damn, a rose grew from concrete. Same thing with me. I grew out of all of this. This is Tupac. Instead of saying, damn, he did this, he did that, right? Just be like, damn, he grew out of that. He came out of that. That's what they should say, right? All the trouble to survive. You see, you wouldn't ask why the rose that grew from concrete had damaged petals. On the contrary, we would all celebrate its tenacity, right? We would all love its will to reach the sun. We are the roses. This is the concrete, and these are my damaged petals. Don't ask me God. Don't ask me why. Thank God. Ask me how, right? And definitely in schools, we get caught up in this, right? That our focus is on the damaged petals rather than on the tenacity. I know just coming back to schools, right, that there wasn't enough systems and structures of support as students were to return, right? The attempt to kind of return back to normal is what we've seen, right? So Yoso's piece works against these trends by highlighting the community cultural wealth that the students bring, right? And these are non-financial assets, resources, contacts, skills, language, intelligence, dress, music, art, used by communities of color to survive oppression, promote well-being, health, and development. The experience, expertise, knowledge, interests you possess matter, right? It is applicable. And that's what we need to demonstrate to these students, right? They come from a very literary rich culture. As an example, they're always texting, they're always reading, and trying to demonstrate how to bridge those gaps for them, right? That is kind of our challenge as educators. So in a class setting, you could work through, you could jigsaw the readings. I've attached it. There's kind of two different things on there. Okay, to kind of work through those pieces. This is a reflection. How are they like the rose that grew from concrete? The petals, what are you striving to become? The stem, the growth, the roots, what are you that keeps you grounded, the soil, and whatnot. The article is here, right? There's kind of the two links, and then there's the scaffold reading by our dear friend Tolteca, who will share the space with us as well at times. And you could get through either or, right? Whatever you prefer. You don't have to get through both if you don't want to. and just helping them process this document, this definition. So we have the definition, the question, and then examples. So list the resources in their lives that have nurtured their growth. Right. Now, I know sometimes Jamboard can be a little tricky. If you ever use it, right? I know we've used it in class with this lesson. After the article, they begin to just kind of work in groups to move these where they would think this would kind of fit, right, through Jamboard. And you can somewhat see it on here, how they have done it. There is no right or wrong answer, right? We just want them to be able to back up their reasoning with some thought and understanding, right? Okay, let me see. All right. Don't think we'll have time to get through this video, but if you haven't seen this, I got this from Dr. Andrade, Chef Duncan Andrade's lecture, and it's a really, really good clip, a story that Maya Angelou shares in terms of her introduction to Tupac, and it just models concrete education, and it comes down to her telling Tupac directly in terms of that he matters, basically, that he's loved, and it's a powerful story. So definitely try to check it out, but we won't have time today, so I apologize. But where we want to get to with the lesson, right, is they kind of work through these, they've worked through the reflection, they're identifying, right? We want them to identify the wealth in their own lives as well. And in that sense, that's a decolonizing practice, right? Because we know in this culture, we tend to think of capital and wealth often as those things we don't have, and just wanting them to celebrate those things that they do. And then once they've kind of come up with their list, we'll use this list that they've created, that they're going to create a mural, right? We kind of walk through murals as a form of community cultural wealth, right? And I know Art Nelson had said it earlier, right? Around challenging the importance of narratives, right? And challenging those dominant narratives. And art, right? Lupe had illustrated the benefits of art as activism. And here, right, for a mural, these murals came up shortly after the George Floyd protest. These ones are in Oakland, but you could definitely find some in your community, right? That resonate with the lives of your students. And how these murals, right, tell these stories through images in these communities that are often very diverse, right? And you have many different strands of languages, but how this mural could kind of embrace what's happening to that diverse community. So we just kind of walk through these slides together, right? How are murals a form of community cultural wealth? What are these artists attempting to state about the cultural capital within their community? Right? You could just see them. It was incredible. I know it was still during COVID, but it was like walking through a gallery, right? And some of you have these in your communities, right? And it is the level of expertise these artists are able to put up throughout our communities is incredible. This is just another link. All right, and then from there, the students kind of create a mural that articulates the cultural capital in their lives, how they are like the roses in concrete, right? What are they striving to become? What has nurtured their growth, right? And these are just a few student examples. You can somewhat see them. All right. Okay. Okay, perfect. All right, any questions about any of this? Thoughts, ideas, questions, something on the document?
I was wondering how you introduce the actual activity where they draw or color.
Good. So getting there, right? Like the one thing we've done is we get here, right, they would talk about lists of resources, people, places, things, phrases in your life that have nurtured your growth, right? So getting there, this would be the backbone of the mural. But I tell them they don't have to use all of them, right? Kind of just starting with the one image that means the most to them, and then kind of let the mural just kind of branch out from there. They're not going to cover all of them. That's not expected, but maybe 3 or 4, right? And eventually they end up doing more than 3 or 4. It just kind of spills over, but kind of just getting them started with one piece. And they would just kind of draw that. They could just kind of outline that at first here, right? Just below in terms of creating that mural. So those type of pieces. And that activity, like I said, the drawing will take a few days. So this probably reflects, like I said, 2 to 3 weeks of work. Okay. Good. It should be, I shared it. You can find it in the chat, the document. You should be able to find the document in the chat. I think it's just a little up above. Okay.
I think Brian had a question about what time of year you usually teach this, when in the school year.
Good. This one was, it looked like this year, I may change it, but this was unit 3, I think, after we talked about race and racism, and then the challenges to talking about race and racism. But it could go at the beginning. I know just in terms of sometimes getting these things up for back to school night is always nice, just to add a little more color to your room and help the students build community by seeing, you know, it's just dope to have their work in these spaces. I'm always amazed by them. Okay.
There was also a question about what do you teach this in? So like not only what time, but within what content area?
So this is an ethnic studies class, right? And like a lot of y'all, ethnic studies has been challenging to get off the, to get embraced by the district. So it is an ethnic studies class. Right now, right? I think I have mostly juniors and seniors right now. I think the district is looking at maybe making some changes, right? But they haven't talked to me about it. So maybe a freshman class later on. But this would be like a junior or senior class. There's other, I know like we have 2 little ones. And there's other ways you could kind of use that poem, right? And there's other drawings you could do to employ in terms of having students identify the cultural capital in their lives. Like for the younger grades, I've seen, I think for our little ones, we kind of just used the petals and then they just kind of wrote on the petals and then they had to puzzle their own petals together, things like that for the K to 8th grade or K to 6, whatever you prefer. Okay. But please, please, please reach out. You're not alone in this work, right? And that's what we want to get across today, hopefully as well. So as things come up throughout the year, you could always email me, connect, let me know how it's going. And that's just kind of how we get through this work together. So thank you so much for sharing this time and space. And hopefully the rest of the year goes really, really, really well for y'all. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Amazing once again. So glad to have you a part of Liberated. Thank you. So moving into our third and final lesson that will sort of close out. And then after that lesson, we'll have probably be overtime, but just take a little bit of time. If you have any questions, we'll be happy to try to answer those a little past 12. But another lesson, I'm going to pass it over to Brian Batugo, who's down here in San Diego with me. We're so lucky to have Brian in San Diego Unified School District making our ethnic studies program happen down here. So I'm going to pass it to you, Brian, and you're doing your own slides?
Yes.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you.
Good morning. Is it morning still? Yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Batugo, he, him, from San Diego. I'm currently in San Diego. I just wanted to just take a moment, like, thank you so much to all the presenters so far who've presented their knowledge, who've shared their resources. It's such an amazing and humbling experience to be in a space that is so dedicated to ensuring, that ethnic studies, critical race theory is not upended or taken out of context. So I think that this space is so important. This is our last presentation, but before we do that, I really just want us to acknowledge that we've been, sitting for a while. So let's just take a moment to, if you need to, go ahead and follow me. I like yoga, but everyone to go ahead and take a deep breath in. Inhale, bring your hands above your head, clasp your fingers together and stretch in your chair. Just get those back muscles, that lower lumbar spine active and active again. Shake your hands out, roll your shoulders back, stretch your neck out, do what you need to do. Because I'm gonna do my best to get through this with some opportunities to participate. But again, thank you again so much for being here. So now I'm going to share my screen. Where's my screen? Oh, wrong screen. Hold on. Wrong screen. And there's too many windows open. Stop share. Share screen. This one. Okay. Cool. And then if there is time, I might be playing a video, like a really quick video. And if you can't hear the sound, someone please tell me. All right. So following Jeffrey's lesson and also the introduction of Yoso's tenets of community cultural wealth, I stumbled, or I wanted to share this lesson idea with you, that really speaks on Yoso's idea of aspirational capital, right? Or engaging in aspirational capital, dreaming, especially in the face of like obstacles or oppressive systems that make it impossible to dream, but you do it anyway. That rose that grew from concrete. In this lesson, it's called Dreaming for My Community. I engage with photo voice, which is a youth participatory action research methodology to collect students' narratives about their communities. Particularly what I'm going to be talking about and kind of sharing is some of the work that I did with some youth in Stockton this past summer in Intro to Ethnic Studies course. It was a 6-week summer program and it was an enrichment class. And so a lot of what I've built out in terms of what I'm sharing with y'all today, and I don't know if I should put those slides in the chat. Let me do that right quick. Cindy loves photo voice. I love photo voice too. That I'm adapting that I used in Stockton this past summer, but I'm adapting for teachers in San Diego Unified School District. Particularly in this unit called Hope and Healing. It's a unit 5. It's supposed to bridge Y part into a history social science course. It's called Identity and Agency in U.S. History. And so a little bit more about me. I'm an ethnic studies resource teacher in San Diego Unified. But before I was here in San Diego, I was a child born, raised in Stockton, California, heart of the Central Valley. And I grew up in a tight-knit Filipino-American community. I grew up learning about my history, learning that Stockton was once the largest home of Filipino Americans from the 1920s to the 1950s. That you would walk into downtown Stockton on the intersection of El Dorado and Lafayette and see things like Los Filipinos tailoring, pool halls, laundromats, restaurants, and then hearing that in the 1960s, this entire community was demolished by the construction of a freeway. And so learning about that history was so powerful for me that when I graduated from high school, I decided to become an ethnic studies major. I decided to keep studying Asian American history, to know that, to learn more about that narrative. And then when I graduated, I went back, I boomeranged back to Stockton and became one of the teachers for the Little Manila After School program, which is a Filipino-American history program modeled after the amazing work of Ate Allison and the folks at PEP in San Francisco, and definitely inspired by the teachings of Dr. Don Mabalo and Dylan Delbo, where we were working with high school youth in the community, teaching them their history and then encouraging them to go to college and boomerang back. So we're always coming back to the community. Knowing that though, I grew up with this counter narrative of Stockton, California, because when you look at media, when you look at the systems that portray and communicate what Stockton is, and if anyone has ever learned about Stockton or followed the 209 Times, you might not see or hear about those narratives that I just shared with you. And so with my students this past summer, I asked them, what do other people see, or how do other people see our community? And with engaging in photo voice, which essentially is allowing them to take a photo and then kind of tell their story based on that photo. Some of my students were seeing, that the people outside of our community might see Stockton as ghetto. It's a violent place to live because those are the things that people Stockton are surrounded by, or that others might see Stockton as a destructive place. They might see it as a dirty place, a poor place with trash scattered around the roads and highways, a place where most drug dealers gather around, or a place where, Stockton's, a place where robbers are out and about. Now that these narratives exist, right? But ultimately, another story, another narrative is something that I wanted to share from one of my students, Sochi. They said, I see Stockton as a very diverse city where people from different places, customs, and languages live in a single community. Stockton might not be the most striking city or the best place to live, but it is a place I would call my second home since my family lives here, right? So engaging with photo voice is in this lesson, dreaming for my community. The objective of this lesson is to identify issues and assets in your community, and then also to utilize aspirational capital to think about new realities in our community rooted in social justice. And so the essential question of this lesson really is, what are my community's strengths and unmet needs? And what are my dreams and hopes for my community? Again, engaging in that aspirational capital. Overall on the right, you kind of see like where I'm going with this, like in the cultural energizer, we kind of break down like what's research, and it's just a discussion that we have in the class. And then we go into what photo voice is, examples of photo voice, and we actually engage in the photo voice project. And then at the end, we talk about next steps. I don't know how much I'm going to be able to go into every single step, but that's the overall plan. And all these resources are definitely here for you to engage with, because I tried to rewrite it so that it wasn't specifically set in Stockton, but I will emphasize that centering it and allowing this to center in the community where you teach, where you live, is essential for this lesson to really thrive and bloom for your students. And so I want to also talk about setting up this lesson, right? So for me, when I taught this at the end of the 6 weeks. It was leading up to our final project. And I had these visions of, youth participatory action research. We were going to go into the community, identify issues, figure out like what are the root causes of those problems, and then do interviews and do all these things, and then try to like present it, right? And then I think big, knowing that this was all like a distance learning project that I was teaching in San Diego while they were in Stockton. And so essentially I had to parse down that vision into something that was doable within, like, I think we had 2 weeks to finish this project. And so a lot of things led up to it. So I wanted to contextualize what happened. So prior to this culminating lesson, students articulated self-identities and shared their personal narratives, right? They discussed race as a social construct, and they also discussed the impact of racism and in history and in their lived realities. They studied the counter narratives of indigenous peoples, African Americans, Chicano, Latino Americans, Asian Americans in US history. Like, we dove into some of that historical context. And then we also studied systems of oppression, right? And then lastly, we ended right before this. I invited some folks from the community. They were local community researchers from Little Manila Rising. They have an amazing youth advocacy program where folks in the community were like kind of doing research and presenting it. So I asked them, hey, can you come through and like talk to my students? And that connection to community really opened up and made the things that we were talking about like real, right? Because they were covering topics such as redlining, environmental racism, immigrant histories, and they were all centered locally in the city of Stockton. Like, it wasn't just like, oh, let's talk about this concept and like zoom out to a textbook example, but it was literally like, let's talk about Stockton right now, involving people who are from Stockton, researchers that I essentially wanted my students to become as well. And not only that, but also possible ways to get involved with the community, to get involved with Little Manila, and organizing and addressing these issues. So with all that said, I was like, all right, let's do this. Let's do some photo voice. Prior to the photo voice actual lesson, I invited a guest. Her name is Celine Lopez, an amazing scholar who graduated from Stanford University and boomeranged back to Stockton. And I keep using that word boomerang because that's like a thing, that's like a term that we use in Stockton for anyone who leaves and then comes back. And so what she did was, with my students, she posed these questions to develop some narratives about Stockton, or to explore narratives about our city. So these are some questions that you could pose with your students in your communities. But the first one, how would you describe your neighborhood? Like, asking students to take a moment to just describe, like, close your eyes, imagine, like, where are you living? Some of my students mentioned things about like cracked sidewalks, fences all over the place, because in Southside Stockton, that's what it looks like. There's definitely a divide with that freeway that was built in Little Manila. You can tell there's the north side and the south side, and there's a difference, right? And they were keen to that because they had just talked about redlining, and in they had a redlining workshop where they were kind of being more aware of those differences, and then being asked to kind of question, like, well, where does that come from, and where's the historical context of that? Another question, what do others say about your neighborhood, your narratives about this? What are the narratives of your city that you've heard? The third question, how do these narratives make you feel? Allowing students to kind of process their reaction to that, right? And then the last one, I think one of the most important questions that definitely needs a lot more time to unpack when you're doing this with your students is, why do you think certain narratives about your neighborhood or city exist? Are they true? Why or why not? And I think that when we started talking about question number 4, that was when we were involving a lot of our learning about systems of oppression, our learning that connected all the things that we set up. And that really flourished. Now, I did it through a Padlet, and we're not gonna do it right now, but I did it through, or Celine did it through a Padlet discussion, and she actually developed these questions. I could also see this for folks in person, like being in circle or doing this as a community, and really either scaffolding it where you have students write all of this down first, talk to their neighbor, and then open out to the community or to the whole class. But I think it's an important conversation to have with your students so they can at least anchor themselves in their community and bring in the knowledge that they've already walked into your classroom with. After that is the part where we engage in some aspirational capital, right? Celine organized a collective vision board, and she asked my students, fam, we're gonna dream right now. Let's just dream. I want you to dream our future. Imagine our world together and just spend 5 minutes, however way you wanna dream. If you're laying down in your bed right now, because this is all online, lay down and daydream. If you need to scribble and write stuff, feel free and do that as well. But she really engaged in a very, like, kind of took the idea of being a daydreamer, or that deficit mindset of people who are just like not paying attention or not on task, to use it as kind of fuel to engage in imagination, right? And so with that, my students just started dreaming futures, right? And they kind of pondered these questions. I want to share these questions with y'all as, again, more ideas to engage in this collective vision board with your students. But what does the future look like in our community? How could our community look different for people of color and youth? Who is our future? Who is our future for? What does liberation look like for our community? What does a liberated future look like, and how do we get there? And again, this could be done as a free write. They did it as a Padlet, but the opportunity for students to just take the time and like brainstorm and dream about another future is such a powerful exercise, and is definitely engaging in that aspirational capital and community cultural wealth. So then this leads, so after all that, so this is all setting up, y'all. Then we did the cultural energizer, right? So in terms of research, I asked students, well, what do you think about when you hear research, right? And let me see, So when I'm going to actually ask that question to you right now, and I'm going to invite folks to drop that in the chat. So I was like trying to figure out, do I have time for this? But let's drop in chat. What do you think about when you hear research? Thank you, Trish. Reading that can help me sleep and power. Okay. Investigation and critical questions. Research by whom? Question mark. Facts and data. I think of applied knowledge. Deep dives. All right. All right. Data that validates us. Research equals me search. Oh, I love that, Jeffrey. That's dope. The next question I like to I post. So sometimes when last time I did this with my students, a lot of folks were like, or a lot of my students also acknowledged how research is boring. Research is not for me. Research sounds like writing a lot of writing too much and I can't finish that project. Like it's a headache, it's stressful. So that was something to also be prepared to acknowledge, because some students might be super disconnected with that term. They might have gotten a really bad experience in schooling with the term research, or they might have been traumatized by like failing a project that was labeled a research project, right? The next question, though, that I also pose to them is who gets to do research? And I think someone in, what's it called? In someone, Gretel, you would talk about research by whom, right? And that was something again, a lot of my students would say, oh, that's like a science thing, right? Like people with lab coats and like goggles, like that's research, right? And so the last one I also add is like, is research important? Why or why not? And I love, yes, thank you so much for jumping in to the chat. Allison, research is systemic inquiry and investigation that aims to gather empirical experience evidence, describe, explain, predict, reflect on phenomena, ultimately to address problems, action. Yes, used for good and evil. Thanks, Trish. We're all researchers in practice, snaps to that. And Gretel, I felt that way about research from white researchers about my cultures. So going into this concept of research and unpacking it, having those discussions are super important in the beginning. And I like to reframe, and I definitely attribute this to my homie, Dr. Ricky Medina, research, reframing it as knowledge production. Like how do our communities produce knowledge, and acknowledging that we've been doing that for since time immemorial. Like we've been doing this already, right? And so I like to also think about it in terms of unpacking our assumptions of who produces and constructs knowledge through research, and also to acknowledge that research comes from a colonial project, right? That it's traumatic. It has been traumatic to Indigenous folks, to Black folks, to POC folks, especially when it comes from that white supremacy cultural lens. But really to take back research as a term and say that BIPOC folks have been producing and constructing knowledge for our communities for centuries, right? I think about, I talk about the healing, I give an example, like, the healing methods from our Indigenous elders. At this point in the lesson, we covered the American Indian movement. And then I try to get them to remember that picture where when the organizers had like their committees set out, that there was a committee for research and development. I connect it back to TWLF and how scholars and activists were developing and writing their own ethnic studies curriculum while they were advocating for it, but that these things were skills that were already embedded in our history and our ancestry, so that we can see ourselves. We should be able to see ourselves as being able to produce our own knowledge, right? And ultimately, research can help us produce knowledge that brings voices and information together to answer important questions and to help make better decisions. I connect back to like Little Manila, right? And I say, y'all, imagine if like the Filipino community, the Chinese American community, the Portuguese community in downtown Stockton came together and showed up somewhere and said, hey, you can't build a freeway here. Look at what's going to happen to all these things. Presented that information. And ultimately, research can give us a voice. It can prepare us to be part of decision-making processes that impact our communities. So it goes back to that action, right? And so photo voice, And this is when I introduced Photo Voice. But Photo Voice is a type of participatory action research. It uses photography, captions to show conditions in a community from different people's perspectives. It's really rooted, I think Photo Voice is very unique in that for this particular lesson is that it needs to be rooted in your community, like wherever you are. Maybe it's your school, if you want to start there. Maybe it's the neighborhood around your school. And I have to acknowledge some teachers don't live in the community that they teach, right? So this is, again, another opportunity for you as a facilitator of this youth participatory action research methodology to learn more about your community and where your students are coming from. And it's very rich in learning about that. And this is participatory in that everyone gets to be part of it. It's all about like each single individual person in the community or in your classroom is actively engaged in this. And that it's action that you're doing something. And ultimately it's to transform our realities, your community's realities. I then jump in to examples of Photo Voice. These examples are from the University of UC Berkeley YPAR Hub, at least these bottom two. And I kind of engage my students in either watching it. They watch in small groups, and then they kind of like dive into these kind of debrief questions together as a team, and then we talk about it. You could do it as whole group deep dive and talk about each example and why each one offers something different or something that's going on or something interesting about what Photo Voice is. But ultimately, it's really getting folks to understand what Photo Voice is. And let me see. I'm going to speed along because we don't have a lot of time, so unfortunately, we can't watch these videos. Major element. Okay. But ultimately, when we go into critical concepts, I go over what an issue is, a general concern or unmet need, what an asset is, a useful or valuable thing, person, or quality that benefits you and your community. And lastly, aspirational capital, the ability to maintain hopes and dreams for the future, even in the face of real and perceived barriers, right? And so a majority of these things, after we go through those critical concepts, I try to connect those back to that Padlet discussion that we had, and then we engage in the actual project. And so I broke it down into 3 steps. Step 1 is to introduce these prompts and to take photos, right? And it's the ultimate goal is to structure how students engage with photography, because sometimes when I was working with my students, they were in that summer mindset. So they were like, I don't want to have to do more work. But I wanted to be sure that they got like these 3 snippets, like they had a clear ask about what they needed to do, so that then they had something to come back to our community to dive into, right? And so traditional Photo Voice methodology recommends that students actually take their own photos, because there's meaning in what they decide to include, what they decide to like focus in on, and they could explain that when they write about their photography. But ultimately, for the purposes of this lesson, I've also done it with having students go into Google image search and find something that also could work. And so these are the 3 prompts that I use. The first photo is how I see my community, goes back to that first Padlet, that Stockton narratives, or that narratives discussion that you would have had. Photo 2 is how others see my community. And then photo 3 is that like something that represents hope, future, a dream for your community. Step 2, they tell their story. So after they grab all their 3 photos, they come to the class. And they share what it means, why they chose them. And then ultimately that's an opportunity for them to decide, and as a group, maybe even work out like, okay, is my story describing an issue in the community, or is my story describing an asset in the community? And it's important to have those discussions, because when you dive into, like if you want to get deeper into YPAR, you can take those issues and as a class decide like, okay, everyone, you can notice a theme in the issues that we have. Should we organize towards a certain, addressing a certain issue? And then also identifying those assets, right? How can we organize to identify those assets and uplift them more? And then lastly, it's about after they get to discuss that and dialogue that, they get to write their story. They get to write a narrative about each photo based based on the discussions that they've had. And so I've included a sample Photo Voice project, the prompts that I use. And ultimately, I also engage in structuring some of their writing so that they have some sentence starters, so they can feel like they can engage and they know how to begin their thoughts. And then ultimately, after they, you know, engage in taking those photos and then writing their stories, I engage with this slide deck template. And then, you know, they put it together. So this is also in the slide deck, so folks can take this, modify it, do what you want to do. But they would be dreaming for the community's name, and then the participant can write their name and put their photos based on the prompts, and then write their stories below it. And so at the end, so these are some of the things that we came up with, right? So with my students, when we said it was called Stockton Dreams. Some of my students were dreaming about, like, after they set up, you know, they acknowledge, like, this is how I see my communities, how other people see it. I wanted to show some of their dreams. So some of their dreams is like, Gian, she wanted more educational programs so that people can, you know, like have a chance to pursue their dreams and have a chance at good schools and good colleges. Another one of my students was really passionate about women and LGBTQ folks, right? Like, and she called out the fact that she wants members of that community to be able to walk home safely at night. Another one of my students was very conscious about, like, our homeless population, and also gang violence, and bringing that up in her dream for a future Stockton. And then the last one, I think this definitely connects back to Jeffrey and your roses, right? But my student took a picture of a rose in her front yard, and she said that Stockton can bloom as a community like a rose, from people seeing Stockton as ghetto to something more family oriented, because she really felt like her asset was her family and, like, these parks that she and her family would go to. So once you have this data, once you have this information, some possible next steps would be now choosing a focus issue to deepen your YPAR investigation, so that you can have students then study some of, like, we're gonna look at, maybe we're studying community safety, or spaces for women and LGBTQ plus to feel safe in the community. Or maybe it's about educational programming, maybe it's about parks, maybe it's about whatever it is. You're able to deep dive into some of that experiential knowledge and bring that and go deeper into research. You could research root causes, partnering with community advocacy groups to partner with their work, and then engaging with local government decision-making bodies. But ultimately, students need to be able to present this data, share it, and deepen that community engagement. And what Ansel Dua says, you know, like, bring the academy to the community. So that, I'm done. I will stop there. Sorry that I took a little bit extra time, y'all.
Thank you so much, Brian, and to all of our presenters. If you all would just take a moment to put an appreciation in the chat for our presenters before we take a few minutes to share some resources and have some Q&A. Anything you'd like to say to any of the presenters, what you got?
Also, at the end, it would be really great if everyone would put in their preferred email address, because we will share the slides and also the documents. A lot of them were in the chat, but we'll curate them for you and send them to you as one email. But we'd prefer if you put your email into the chat, because then it helps us weed out, like, who was here and who wasn't.
We also added to the Google Docs a couple of short resource materials that you could use. We're actually building on this as we speak, but folks have asked for, like, maybe a short description of what critical race theory is and a couple of resources. We'll definitely add this session today to that resource list. I also want to thank our presenters and our awesome LESMC faculty who work on their own time, aside from everything else they do, to develop these incredible lessons and materials to share with you all today. You wanted to show that final slide, Trish, so that we could.
Sure. I just dropped the resources in the chat again on CRT, so you can see that there. And again, yes, please add your email. And then Maybe I'll show you the final slide and then we'll go to Q&A. Just so you are aware, we are having a panel discussion beyond Native American Heritage Month coming up very soon in 10 days, November 30th. The Zoom ID is right there, but we will send that to you. We're very lucky to have our own Mary Levi moderating the panel with Andrew Jolivet, Brownie Nadeau, Melissa Marino, and Robert Levi. So please don't miss that. Let people know about it. And then I'm just going to move us back to Q&A and what questions you might have. So feel free to drop a question in the chat. We'll take another maybe 5 minutes before we close. Or if you want to, we can try unmuting and see if that works as well. And you can direct it just generally or to someone in particular.
While you're reflecting on your questions, let us know what we can do to support your work in ethnic studies. In January, we'll also be having a session for our white co-conspirators in ethnic studies, and then sharing a few lessons on how to reach white students within an ethnic studies class. So as you come to our sessions, you give us ideas for other things that you would like to hear, other lessons you would like to see. I do want to acknowledge that I saw a request for elementary lessons. And so we're in the process of developing those lessons as we speak. Like I said, our folks do this on their spare time. And these are incredible educators who work more than obviously the time in their classroom to promote and support ethnic studies.
We do have a few elementary lessons already available on the liberatedethnicstudies.org website. The lessons that are on there are the samples of the ones that we've completed at the pre-K through 2, and then the 3 to 5 or 3 to 6, and then 7 to 12 level. But more are coming, as Teresa said. We've got about 70 folks that are members of the LESMC, and everyone is working really hard to get that robust lesson plan resource out for you all. So as the weeks go by, as you check out our website, you'll see that more and more lessons are going to be populated there.
So I want to respond to Arlene's question about how we address capitalism and how it connects to structural racism. I think we do it in terms of the intersectionality between race and class. Lessons on gentrification, right, and profit as a means of privatization of schooling. We also address it in our lessons on incarceration, on decolonizing our diet. I mean, there are several ways to show what capitalism has done to our communities and to our people. So we, again, like critical race theory, we don't develop lesson plans that are quote unquote going to discuss about the evils of capitalism, but we do have lessons that raise questions and critiques and ideas about what profit motives, what gentrification, and what capitalism has done to our communities. And maybe that's a session, Arlene, that we could also integrate in the future.
Other
questions? Could I just say one thing about that?
Sure.
I mean, why I asked that question is everything you talk about building the community and, and affirming the identity. It just seems to go so opposite from our societal capitalistic in how we're ingrained. So thank you.
Absolutely.
We have about 1 more minute. If there's one more question someone would like to unmute or put in the chat.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being with us today. We know it is the Saturday before many of you have the week off for much needed and much deserved rest and relaxation. We will keep you posted. Thank you so much to our presenters. You always come through for us. And I think you are examples of what makes liberated ethnic studies the have the curriculum that we have. We are you, you are us, and we welcome all of you to our community today, and then hopefully from this day forward.
We are not on Twitter. we need help with our social media, quite honestly, because we're all stretched so thin. But yes, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, we're working on our TikTok. But yeah, definitely, if anyone out there wants to be a social media person, let us know, because we'll embrace that wholeheartedly.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, we welcome you to join our community. This is a labor of love. And, you know, if you are at the space where you feel you would love to contribute your work, you know, please let us know.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. That was loud at my house. My she's picking up the lunch duty over here.
Thank you, everyone.